The first morning began in gray and steam. I stood at the corner of Madison and Wells with my paper cup pressing warmth into my palms, the sky a sheet of pewter over the city. The crosswalk ticked its slow metronome, and cabs sighed to the curb, their windows fogged, people inside silhouettes gesturing toward a better day. When the light turned, I stepped into a shallow puddle anyway and watched the ring of water ripple outward, mapping circles like a topography of distraction. My reflection was a smear in it. Woman in her late 40s, steady mouth, the kind of eyes that had learned to listen before speaking. The coffee tasted like late nights and deadlines. I told myself it tasted like control. Upstairs, the 7th floor hummed with what only looked like calm. At Rook and Lane, architecture thrummed through the building, printers exhaled blueprints, plotters whispered, engineers padded by with rolled sets clipped under their arms like lances. Conference room glass held the skyline like a captive, rain chalking down it in soft verticals. Someone had left jazz playing low in the kitchen, muted brass, the heartbeat of piano, so that the espresso machine sounded like percussion. I liked the sound of paper more. The drag of a plan across a table, the way a pencil paused before a note as if thinking could mark space. I had been divorced for 3 years by then. The first year was a storm blown through a house with too many windows. The second, a plain rebuild, no trim, nothing decorative. The third, I learned to love my kitchen light and the footprint of a plant on the sill, the discipline of Sunday laundry, the strange experience of nobody asking where I had put their shoes. My son was in Colorado with a scholarship and a bike and a laugh he texted me in fragments. I wore a simple ring on my right hand because my thumb missed the habit of circling something while I read. My desk had a photo of a slant of river light, not a person. I was careful with choices. I was careful. That Monday, the new chief executive arrived. I had seen his name on the internal memo. Evan Marlowe, hired by the board to steady us after a year of overreach and a PR bruise when a boutique hotel we'd designed downtown turned out to be less than friendly to the neighborhood that had once held it. He came from a West Coast firm with a reputation for stitching green roofs into ancient skylines. The email had been spare, a paragraph about leadership and listening, like a decree in a new country where the laws were still soft. There was no photo attached, which unsettled the marketing team into unusual silence. He walked through the glass doors without making a sound out of it. Tall, yes, but not the predictable kind of imposing. He wore a suit like an apology he'd decided to accept. There was gray at his temples, but not the kind that had to announce experience. It simply sat there like slate under fresh water. He met each person's eyes at exactly the pace they needed and nodded as if their names were not just names but coordinates. He shook hands with the board and with the receptionist. He greeted the facilities team by their first names. I watched him watch the view. I knew the way CEOs took possession of glass. He didn't. He stood at a respectful distance from the window, like you do from a sleeping animal. He asked to sit in on the Midtown Depot meeting. The depot was our moonshot, a brick and iron train depot built in 1913, sleeping with pigeons and stray cats in its rafters now, a cathedral of disuse every photographer in the city loved to trespass. The city had released an RFP that was equal parts poetry and threat. Convert this into an arts and tech hub with public space, affordable studios, high-efficiency guts, and a business model that would resist the slow creep of pasteurized coffee and designer boredom. The big firms were circling. My team, mostly younger than my favorite coat, had been working for 6 months to present a plan both visionary and viable. We had lights in our eyes we hadn't had in years. I led the meeting. I did not think about the new CEO while I did it. That was my pride. I drew the depot's bones in the air with my hands as I spoke. This is where the public yard could spill out in summer. This is where heat could be harvested from bodies dancing. This is where the small theater could host middle school productions, so they remember how a building can hold a voice. I described co-op studios with sliding scale rent and a residency tied to local schools. I described a market that paid back into its street. I described a building that breathed, that didn't just eat energy but made it. My team added layers, mechanical brilliance from Wei, soundscapes from the acoustic designer, financial feasibility from Raj, who lived and died by spreadsheets and second chances. I watched nods ripple around the table like wind over prairie grass. Evan did not interrupt. He took a pen from his pocket, simple, weighty, and traced something on the margin of the RFP copy. When I paused, he asked a quiet question about stormwater capture, not in the way of a test, but like a person who might genuinely be curious about rain. Wei leaned forward, delighted. They talked about cisterns like they were talking about a book both had loved in childhood. I felt several pairs of eyes slide toward me, measuring whether I would cede oxygen. I said we had a proposal that dovetailed with the city's new incentives. I kept my voice tempered, the way I do when handling glass. After the meeting, there was the careful corridor choreography of people who both want to speak to a new power and want to be seen not wanting. He walked beside me, hands in pockets, slow enough for my stride, which I resented him for noticing. He said he had read my previous work, the Riverfront Community Center in Southtown, the clinic with windows like gentle hands. He said I made rooms that didn't punish people for needing them. He said the depot should have someone like me at its heart. I told him it had plenty of hearts. I was simply the one with a spare battery. He smiled, not with his mouth, exactly. He said he hoped I would consider being the point on everything public-facing. The council meetings, the neighborhood walkthroughs, the shepherding of the narrative. He said he would be there, but he trusted me to be the voice. I told him that voice cost time and the train would not design itself. He said he would make room for both. I thought he was making promises available only to men who took for granted that time bowed for them the way revolving doors did. The gossip started by afternoon. It always does in companies that speak in glass. People said he was 3 years widowed, no children. People said his previous firm had begged him to stay. People said he read novels on planes and never slept. People said he had a way of watching an argument resolve itself that made you think you resolved it. People said he smelled like cedar. I didn't know why that mattered until I was stuck in the elevator with him 2 nights later, holding my laptop in one hand and a set of drawings in the other, and the lights went out for exactly 3 seconds. The emergency system kicked in, a hum in the walls, thin as a held breath. He was a line of shadow a foot away. I had been annoyed with the day until then. After the light steadied, annoyance seemed like a child's toy I could step over. He asked if I was all right. I said I was old enough to sit in the dark without making it all about me. He laughed under his breath, the laugh of someone left-handed in a world built for right. The elevator hummed. We both listened to it and pretended not to hear each other listening. He said he had noticed the way I stood at the depot's south entrance in the photos, my hand hovering over the banister like I was promising it something. I said I had been measuring the turn in the stair. He said sometimes a hand was a measure. It was quiet. His phone lit his face and then went dark. I could smell the winter in his coat. I could hear my own breath, steady like someone walking away from an argument, and then, eventually toward it again. When the doors opened on 7, we stepped out as if the elevator hadn't hurt our composure. In the lobby, the receptionist looked up, then down, like a woman who knew the difference between accidents and emergencies. He asked if I was headed back. I said I had one more hour in me. He nodded as if an hour were something I had to land, and he was trustworthy with borrowed things. This is how it starts sometimes. Not with a declaration, not with a touch, but with the economy of a nod. The depot consumed us. We spent evenings in the conference room with the city maps spread like quilts. The glass fogged with our breath and then clarified, minute by minute, as if the building were teaching us how to see it. Evan sat in on more sessions, not dominating, simply asking questions that redistributed weight. Where else can we make this work for people who never thought they'd be welcome? Why does this corridor feel like a threat to a woman leaving after dark? Who are we pretending to be with this finish? He carried authority like you carry a sleeping child, carefully, protecting its head. Keith from business development began to bring us any rumor he could harvest. He had the smile of a man who had loved his own hair in the mirror once and hated it for leaving him. He hinted that it might be reckless to put the company's legacy ride or die on a public project when corporate clients were easier, cleaner, more forgiving. He complimented the depot's poetry with a little sigh, as if poetry were something you pin to a corkboard and sigh about. He asked questions about budget allocations in the tone of a doctor asking if you were absolutely sure about the surgery. He tried the phrase optics more than once. He spoke of the board with untraceable intimacy. When he left meetings, he always put a hand on someone's shoulder, a gesture his lawsuits would one day call benign. The story of a company is written not just in proposals, but in the ways we stand in hallways. In the kitchen, whispers frayed themselves on the edges of ceramic mugs. Some said Avon had been hired to sell us to a larger firm. Some said he was the board's last attempt to right the ship before it ran aground. Some said my selection as public point person was smart and inevitable. Some said it was reckless and smelled like favoritism. Some of those who said it were careful where they stood, watching their words float in the glass, testing angles. I learned to hear my name spoken by people who didn't use it. We took one mercy break in all that, a week where the city delayed the second round of presentations, and I was scheduled for a conference in Boston. Evan ended up speaking on a panel there, last-minute substitution for a woman who had taken ill. He told me when we ran into each other at the hotel coffee stand. We were both underslept and overdressed, and Boston was doing its best imitation of April, even though the calendar insisted on May. We walked to the conference together like colleagues who knew how to hold a public distance. In the corridor outside the ballroom, we stood under a skylight that made even worry look lit. He thanked me for a memo I had written to the board about affordable artist housing that made some of them nervous. He said the memo had made them nervous in the right way. He said he owed me dinner. We ate later at a quiet place with a velvet banquet and a maitre who greeted us like a secret. He talked about his late wife, not in the way of a man who needs pity, but as someone handing you a stone he carried so you could feel its weight. He said she had a way of seeing what was to be done that ignored all vanity. He said he had met her at a fundraiser and not noticed her until she noticed him, and then he had been noticed forever. He said grief was a change in elevation your body never quite adapted to. So you measured breath differently from then on. I told him my divorce hadn't been tragic, just ordinary, which is its own tragedy. I told him we had been good people who ran out of space for each other. I told him the gift of it was that I knew now how to be alone without dramatizing it. He looked at me as if I'd said something brave and unperformative. He said the depot needed people with ordinary tragedies in its bones. After dinner, he walked me back through a light rain, our umbrellas making their small private roofs. The city smelled like slate and bread. A jazz trio played in a half-empty bar as we passed, bass line a tether in the dark. We didn't go in. We paused under the awning of the hotel and listened to the rain striking the canvas in its polite, relentless way. He reached to tuck a stray piece of hair behind my ear and stopped himself before he touched me, like a pilot checking a gauge twice. He said, so quietly I almost missed it, that he had never liked a coincidence until tonight. I told him I didn't believe in them, only in the ways we rationalized the patterns we desperately wanted to see. He laughed. He said the patterns were there whether or not I gave them permission. On the plane home, I pretended to sleep and thought about the shape of his restraint. I decided it was either kindness or the most seductive thing I'd ever been offered. I was old enough to know it could be both. The crisis arrived the way a siren does, far, and then abruptly near. 2 weeks later, with the depot second round presentation approaching, our preliminary financial model, our most guarded numbers, leaked to a city blog that specialized in breathless scoops and rigorous typos. They published a half-accurate spreadsheet and a commentary accusing Rook and Lane of pretending to affordability while planning a tax credit boondoggle. The tone was familiar, triumphant contempt. The impact was immediate. The city called. The board panicked. Our communications team went into an 8-person version of fight or flight. Someone in HR looped in the legal team, which is like inviting your own dentist to a picnic. People looked at me and at Evan and at the glass ceiling, which gave no answer. We gathered in Conference A, the big one with the best view, the one we always pretended to forget had a door that didn't quite latch. Evan stood at the front, profile to the room, reading the blog as if it were a very small book. He asked calm questions about which documents had been shared outside of a small circle. He had legal draft a statement that did not over-explain. He suggested we convene a meeting with the city to clarify good faith. He borrowed nothing from anyone's panic. HR wanted to know if any person with late-night access to certain folders had ever been in a position to be compromised. The phrase floated over the table like a balloon somebody had drawn a face on. I felt my face flush. Not because I was guilty, but because the wording carried the condescension of someone who assumed only 2 people in a room knew how to read. Late-night access might as well have had my name in parentheses. I often stayed long after the office dimmed into its soft lattice of darkness. The glass remembered who stood near it. It escalated with an ugly efficiency. Someone hinted to someone else that perhaps the depot team, in its zeal, had grown careless. The blog ran a follow-up insinuating an inappropriate relationship among senior staff, a cheap flare shot into a cloudy sky. They didn't use names. They didn't have to. The world loves implying precise sin with general language. HR asked to speak to me informally, which is code for checking if you will perjure yourself before they ask you to. I sat in a small room with a plant pretending to be cheerful and a binder pretending to be thick. They asked if I had seen the leaked figures before the leak. They asked if I had shared a draft with anyone outside my immediate team. They asked if I had ever been in the office late alone with the CEO. I told them yes. I told them yes again. I told them their phrasing suggested a cultural problem bigger than a spreadsheet. Afterwards, in the corridor, I found Evan leaning against the glass like a man who understood something about angles and fatigue. He asked if I wanted representation present for anything going forward. He asked if I wanted to be reassigned while the investigation ran, to protect me publicly. He asked as if choices could still be made, as if not everything had already been made into us and them. I told him I did not want to be reassigned. I told him that would read as admission, and I hadn't done anything wrong but stay late to keep a promise to a sleeping building. He nodded. He said he had asked for logs from Ete, and he would have them by morning. He looked like a person who had run far with good form, and then realized he had to run farther. It's dangerous, the way a crisis teaches you what you are to someone. That night, I stayed again. The office was soft with its usual after-hours kindnesses. The HVAC thrummed like a cat asleep somewhere you can't see, the copier's brilliant odd silence, the long line of windows rendering the city in charcoal and silver. I made tea I wouldn't drink and stood with my hand on the back of a chair, the way a conductor rests between movements. He appeared in the doorway without announcing himself. I didn't startle. We were past the point of pretending we were new to each other's presence. He said he had the logs. He said the download came from Keith's credentials 4 nights ago, at 11:13 p.m. He said they were tracing whether those credentials had been used by someone else or whether Keith had been habitually careless with security. He said he had texted legal. He said he had sent HR a note with the kind of words that made them review their own notes more carefully. He said he would deal with the board in the morning. I said it was almost never the person you wanted it to be. Even when it was, your heart had to realign itself around disappointment. He looked at me with the concentration I had resented the first day, the kind that does not compliment you so much as recruit you. He shut the conference room door behind him and stood too far from me to be mistaken, too close to be misread. He said something then that made time behave strangely. He said, "You remind me of the woman I should have married." He took a breath as if the sentence had a climb in it. I should have walked away from that thought the moment it arrived. He went on, but I didn't. There it was. The line that knocks loose the scaffolding you built to keep temptation decorous. I stood very still. I liked the truth much more than I liked the idea of it. He went on quietly, choosing each word like you choose a glass you don't want to crack. He said he knew the cost of carelessness. He said he also knew the cost of living with a jaw so tight your life couldn't enter. He said he had not moved toward me, and he would not move unless I did. He said he would weather a rumor. He would not weather the kind of regret you only earn by mistaking caution for integrity. I listened to my own life arrange itself under his voice. There are moments when the water around you is very clear. You can see the pebbles, the fractures, the impossibility of being nothing but clean. I thought of my son and how I had learned to tell him that love, real love, didn't always come dressed like a promise. Sometimes it arrived in a good-looking suit with fatigue around the eyes, saying the word should the way a man confesses to an unbuilt room. I came very near and then stopped. It was a near that made everything that hadn't happened yet tilt toward happening. He watched my decision like you watch a storm you would steer a boat through if you trusted the boat. I said, mostly to myself, that I was too old to confuse desire with drama. I said, mostly to him, that I would not hide in a room like a frightened intern. I said I could want him and want my work clean, and those two sentences did not cancel each other. I said if we did this, we'd do it with the lights on in our own heads. He looked like a man being told he was not alone. We did not touch then. It felt impossible at first, and then it felt like the only decision that protected the sanctity of what I wanted. The night held. The windows were a little constellation of offices across the city, people sitting in rectangles of light doing things they would not confess, or else simply making spreadsheets while their hearts fell asleep. We stood there until the hush rearranged itself around us. He left first, on purpose, so that if anyone asked, I could tell the truth when I said I closed down the office alone. He said goodnight in a voice that made my ribcage feel like architecture again, function and structure, and the way light travels through. The next day the logs turned into a reckoning. It showed that Keith's credentials hadn't been stolen. He'd sent the files to a personal email, then to a reporter he had lunched with twice in 1 month. The reporter, blessedly clumsy, had left his metadata showing. Legal prepared the kind of letter that folds men in on themselves. HR shifted into the posture of a department trying to look as if it had warned everyone all along. The board wanted blood and indemnity in that order. Keith had explanations that were more like adjectives than reasons. He had been trying to warn the city about shady math. He had been trying to test the integrity of our proposal. He had been drunk when he hit send. He had swallowed a story that made him the noble internal dissenter, and when it cracked, he held the shards like proof. They put him on leave so he could be fired more politely. The blog posted a retraction disguised as an update. The city still wanted to see us. Evan and I sat in the council chambers under lights that turned faces into planes. He spoke with that exact measured warmth that made even people who opposed him feel consulted. I presented the corridors and stairs I had measured with my hand. Neighborhood advocates asked sharp questions about policy and follow-through, and the timeline between poetry and construction trucks. We answered questions until the room felt less like a courtroom and more like a room, which is not nothing. When we left, he put his hand at the small of my back in the old-fashioned way a man claims to be gentlemanly while he is setting a pace only the two of you can feel. I let him. The press took photos that made us look like partners. They didn't know in which sense. That night, he did come to my office. He didn't walk in dressed like an emergency. He came in the way a kind man comes to a threshold he has been invited to. We stood close. I could smell rain in his coat again. It was raining, because of course it was. He told me a story, finally, that had nothing to do with the firm or its politics. He told me about the time he had driven all night to see his late wife at a hospital after her surgery, and how the nurse had told him to sleep in his car because there were no chairs left, and he'd said he would stand up in the waiting room if he had to. He said a janitor had wheeled him in a broken office chair and sat with him and listened to him not talk, and that was the moment he had decided to spend his life trying to build places that honored the people who cleaned them. He said you didn't need grand reasons to be good. You needed a clear one and a door you held open. He said he wanted to be honest, which is something people say when they're about to tell you one thing and ask for another. He said he wanted to see where this led if we didn't scare it into running. He said he wouldn't compromise my work, my reputation, my standing, my sense of myself. He said he knew I had survived something people mistake for mundane, and that made me particular in my demands. He said this very softly, as if he knew my pride had a hair trigger, and he was asking it to lower its weapon. I touched the sleeve of his shirt. That was all, and it felt like saying yes in a language nobody could overhear. We stood a long time with no urgency beyond breath. The city lights made their little staggered constellations across the river. Traffic drew lines of red and white, moving slowly like blood in winter. When he did lower his head toward me, he stopped again, giving me a chance to step back. I didn't. The kiss was both the first and something preceded by the long courtship of not kissing. Heat has its own pace, and we were old enough to respect it. There are details the body remembers that prose should not record. I will say only that the night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. We didn't become careless. The rumor mill, starved of scandal, manufactured pieties. HR completed their report with the relief of people who could now return to workshops about acceptable email etiquette. The board approved our budget with 3 addenda, and a watchfulness that felt less like distrust and more like good governance. The city, after 2 more rounds of public comment and a glorious fight over the color of brick that turned into an argument about history, approved a preliminary agreement. The depot exhaled dust one last time and then woke. In the weeks that followed, we made a practice out of ordinary. Meetings ran their gauntlets. The elevator hummed without incident. We both learned the choreography of proximity and distance. Some days we didn't speak beyond a nod in the corridor. Some nights he came to my apartment, and we ate simple things at my kitchen island and left the plates unwashed because we preferred the chaos of our laughter. My son came home for a long weekend in June, and the two of them talked as if they had once known each other in a different city. Evan kept his hand to himself until my son left, which is one of those small choices that tells you the shape a man draws around the people you love. We never signed a contract. We built a habit. In the office, we were two professionals who could stand at opposite ends of a table and make the table believe in its own purpose. Outside, we were people who had decided that tenderness was not a liability. We were not naive. We knew that whatever we were was subject to the same forces that weather glass, that distort lines, that require repairs. We knew you can't build anything meant to last without budgeting for maintenance. One afternoon in August, I stood in the depot as the first crews set up scaffolding. Dust drifted through a shaft of light like old paper reconsidered. The columns rose like the original engineers had trusted us to meet them halfway across time. I closed my eyes and put my hand on the banister of the south stair the way I had in the photograph. Behind me, footsteps I knew by the way they measured the floorboards approached. He didn't come up beside me. He stopped a step below, so I looked bigger in the room than he did. He said the councilwoman had named the apprenticeship program after her grandmother. He said the HVAC contractors had offered to hire 2 kids from the neighborhood. He said in 6 months there would be a winter evening here with a market and a small orchestra on a platform, and I would stand where I stood now and watch people belong. I told him that was a good forecast, which is the praise I give when I am protecting my own heart from weather. He asked, in a tone that didn't demand, whether we were ready to begin telling people. He said he'd followed my lead on secrecy. He said the fact of us had become less a fragile thing and more a part of the architecture. I thought about the office, about the people who would be generous and those who would forgive us nothing because their own disappointments needed a place to sit. I thought about my privacy, which I wore like a blouse washed thin but still cherished. I told him we could tell the people who mattered and let it travel organically, like a rumor that had faith. I said we owed nobody anything, and we owed everyone dignity. He said that sounded like a policy and he would adopt it. Later, in a boardroom with lights that always seemed brighter than necessary, a member asked whether we'd learned anything from the leak. Evan said yes, we'd learned that transparency had to be practiced at the pace of trust, not publication. He looked at me when he said it, the way a man might look at a bridge he has watched hold. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. There were harder days. There always are. A subcontractor failed us, and the timeline shuddered. A councilman decided to grandstand. A winter storm broke a pipe in the old boiler room, and we walked in slush for a week. Evan made one call I disagreed with profoundly about a slate of outside consultants, and I told him so in a tone that would have buckled a younger man's ego. He listened, modified, and told me later that love didn't ask you to accept another's worst instincts. It asked you to keep them honest. We fought in a way that kept our best selves employed. The depot leaned into its future with a grace I didn't trust, until I saw a little girl in a polka-dot raincoat press her hand to the glass one Sunday morning during community tours and say to her mother that the building had eyes and she liked the way it blinked. It's tempting to turn this into a romance that absolves us of everything. But we were adults. Absolution isn't on the menu. What we had was something slower, sturdier. A series of choices made quietly and kept. On a late November evening, after a long day of negotiating with a restaurateur who thought sustainability was a buzzword for cocktail lists, we walked along the river. The city had gone early dark, and the lights lifted themselves one floor at a time. He told me he had been offered a book deal to write about leadership and the built environment. He said he didn't want to write it unless I would write it with him, or at least be the ghost that does not haunt but clarifies. I told him maybe, if the depot opened and didn't break our hearts. He said buildings always break your heart, and that's why we build more carefully next time. He reached for my hand then, not dramatically but with an old man's humor about his own hesitations. He asked if I wanted to get married someday, like a person asking if you liked winter and why. I told him I didn't know. I told him I liked partnership more than ceremony. I told him this from a place of love, not fear. He nodded, and we let the question sit there, unthreatened, as the river moved under us with its slow, obedient muscle. Months later, as the depot took its final shape, I found myself alone in the office after yet another evening where the printers and I had agreed on what paper should mean. The lights dimmed one by one. The building has a routine, and I respect routines. I gathered my coat. In the reflection of the glass, the city looked like a place where everything is always happening to someone else. I could see my own face superimposed on it. I felt steadier than I had in years. He appeared in the doorway with that careful step that told me he would not be the thing that startles. He had a small bouquet from the corner flower stand, the tired kind of bouquet that needs a good home, and he looked pleased with his own lack of sophistication about it. He said the electricians had found a time capsule in the depot's north wall, a folded newspaper from the day the station opened, and a letter from a woman who had been a night cleaner then, thanking the architect for letting her bring her daughter to see the building before dawn. He said the letter had made him cry in an unglamorous way. He said the city would display it in a shadow box near the stair. I thought of the janitor with the broken office chair. I thought of the woman with the broom and her daughter watching light move through girders before the rush of trains. I thought of the building blinking for a little girl decades later in a polka-dot raincoat. I thought of my own son, threading his way through his life like a man carrying something tender but not fragile. I thought of the way stories choose us if we behave ourselves well enough to notice. He asked if I was coming home. He meant his place. He meant mine. He meant the place we had made between them where there was a chair for sadness and a shelf for relief. I said yes. We turned off the last lamp together. As we walked down the corridor, he put his hand at the small of my back, and I did not pretend I had not been waiting for that simple claim all my life. In the elevator, the hum was the same as it had been that first night, but it now felt less like a test and more like a lullaby. We stepped into the lobby. The guard nodded, the kind of nod that carries secrets with dignity. The street tasted like snow. I slid my arm through his and we moved in time, no rush, no theater. The choice had been made. The choices would continue. We would make them. The office lights dimmed one by one behind us, but his shadow always lingered near mine. The two shapes stretched across the glass, overlapping, like something designed and something discovered sharing the same line. On the night the depot opened for its first winter market, a soft evening, the air full of mulled spice and flower, and the boot-scuff rhythm of a community trying on its own reflection, I stood on the mezzanine and watched people assume a space built for them. Evan came to stand beside me but not in front. He handed me a cup of something warm. He said nothing for a long time. Neither did I. That was the lesson, maybe, at the end of all of it. That you could love someone without narrating it constantly, that you could build something public and keep something private, that you could take the risk halfway through your life, and find it was less of a plunge and more of a step onto a surface that held. He looked at me then with the expression he keeps for only two occasions: when a design resolves and when I enter a room. I thought of the sentence that had started this, the dangerous, tender sentence with the word should in it, and how I had come to forgive the word, to refit it into our lives like a reclaimed beam. He murmured that this was better than the book deal would have been. I said the book could wait. The orchestra began to tune. A child laughed. A woman with a broom leaned it against a column and pointed with both hands at the lights. The world, stern and incessant, kept moving. We stood there anyway, steady as architecture, warmed by our own weather, aging with grace as if grace were simply a habit we had finally learned to keep.